When I was a small boy, my father would take me each year around the battlefields of the First World War, the conflict that H.G. Wells called the war to end all wars. We would set off each summer in our Austin of England and bump along the potholed roads of Somme, Ypres, and Verdun. By the time I was 14, I could recite the names of all the offensives: Bapaume Hill 60, High Wood, Passchendaele. I had seen all the graveyards, and I had walked through all the overgrown trenches, and touched the rusted helmets of British soldiers and the corroded German mortars in decaying museums. My father was a soldier of the Great War, fighting in the trenches of France because of a shot fired in a city he'd never heard of, called Sarajevo. And when he died 13 years ago at the age of 93, I inherited his campaign medals. One of them depicts a winged victory, and on the obverse side are engraved the words, "The Great War for Civilization." To my father's deep concern and my mother's stoic acceptance, I have spent much of my life in wars. They, too, were fought for civilization. In Afghanistan, I watched the Russians fighting for their international duty in a conflict against international terror. Their Afghan opponents, of course, were fighting against communist aggression, and for Allah. I reported from the front lines as the Iranians struggled through what they called the imposed war against Saddam Hussein, who dubbed his 1980 invasion of Iran the Whirlwind War. I've seen the Israelis twice invading Lebanon and then re-invading the Palestinian West Bank in order, so they claimed, to purge the land of terrorism. I was present as the Algerian military went to war with Islamists for the same ostensible reason, torturing and executing their prisoners with as much abandon as their enemies. Then, in 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and the Americans sent their armies to the Gulf to liberate the emirate and impose a new world order. After the 1991 war, I always wrote down the words "New World Order" in my notebook, followed by a question mark. In Bosnia, I found Serbs fighting for what they called Serb civilization, while their Muslim enemies fought and died for a fading multicultural dream and to save their own lives. On a mountaintop in Afghanistan, I sat opposite Osama bin Laden in his tent as he uttered his first direct threat against the United States. Pausing as I scribbled his words into my notebook by paraffin lamp, God and evil were what he talked to me about. I was flying over the Atlantic on September 11th, 2001. My plane turned round off Ireland following the attacks on the United States, and so less than 3 months later I was in Afghanistan, fleeing with the Taliban down a highway west of Kandahar, as America bombed the ruins of a country already destroyed by war. I was in the United Nations General Assembly exactly a year after the attacks on America, when George Bush talked about Saddam's non-existent weapons of mass destruction and prepared to invade Iraq. The first missiles of that invasion swept over my head in Baghdad. The direct physical results of all these conflicts will remain, and should remain, in my memory until I die. I don't need to read through my mountain of reporters' notebooks to remember the Iranian soldier on the troop train north to Tehran, holding towels and coughing up Saddam's gas in gobs of blood and mucus as they read the Quran. I need none of my newspaper clippings to recall the father, after an American cluster bomb attack on Iraq in 2003, who held out to me what looked like half a crushed loaf of bread, but which turned out to be half a crushed baby. Or the mass grave outside Nasiriyah, in which I came across the remains of a leg with a steel tube inside and a plastic metal disc still attached to a stump of bone. Saddam's murderers had taken their victim straight from the hospital where he had his hip replacement to his place of execution in the desert. I don't have nightmares about these things, but I remember. The head blasted off the body of a Kosovo Albanian refugee in an American air raid 4 years earlier, bearded and upright in a bright green field as if a medieval axeman had just cut him down. The corpse of a Kosovo farmer murdered by Serbs. His grave opened by the UN, so that he re-emerges from the darkness, bloating in front of us, his belt tightening viciously around his stomach, twice the size of a normal man. The Iraqi soldier at FAO during the Iran-Iraq War who lay curled up like a child in the gun pit beside me, black with death, a single gold wedding ring glittering on the third finger on his left hand, bright with sunlight and love for a woman who did not know she was a widow. Soldier and civilian, they died in their tens of thousands because death had been concocted for them. Morality hitched like a halter around the war horse so that we could talk about target-rich environments and collateral damage, that most infantile of attempts to shake off the crime of killing, and report the victory parades, the tearing down of statues, and the importance of peace. Governments like it that way. They want their people to see war as a drama of opposites, good and evil, them and us, victory or defeat. But war is primarily not about victory or defeat, but about death and the infliction of death. It represents the total failure of the human spirit. I know an editor who has wearied of hearing me say this, but how many editors have first-hand experience of war? Ironically, it was a movie that propelled me into journalism. I was 12 years old when I saw Alfred Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, a black and white 1940 creaky of patriotism and equally black humor, in which Joel McCrea played an American reporter called John Jones, renamed Huntley Haverstock by his New York editor, who was sent in 1939 to cover the approaching war in Europe. He witnesses an assassination, chases Nazi spies in Holland, uncovers Germany's top agent in London, is shot down in an airliner by a German pocket battleship, and survives to scoop the world. He also wins the most gorgeous woman in the movie, clearly an added bonus for such an exciting profession. The film ends in the London Blitz with a radio announcer introducing Haverstock on the air. We have, as a guest tonight, one of the soldiers of the press, he says, one of the little army of historians who are writing history from beside the cannon's mouth. I never looked back. I read my father's conservative Daily Telegraph from cover to cover, always the foreign reports, lying on the floor beside the fire as my mother pleaded with me to drink my cocoa and go to bed. At school, I studied the Times each afternoon. I plowed through Khrushchev's entire speech denouncing Stalin's reign of terror. I won the school current affairs prize, and never, ever could anyone shake me from my determination to be a foreign correspondent. When my father suggested I should study law or medicine, I walked from the room. When he asked a family friend what I should do, the friend asked me to imagine I was in a courtroom. Would I want to be the lawyer or the reporter on the press bench, he asked me. I said I would be the reporter, and he told my father, Robert is going to be a journalist. I wanted to be one of the soldiers of the press. I joined the Newcastle Evening Chronicle then the Sunday Express diary column, where I chased vicars who had run off with starlets. After 3 years, I begged the Times to hire me, and they sent me to Northern Ireland to cover the vicious little conflict that had broken out in that legacy of British colonial rule. 5 years later, I became one of those soldiers of journalism, a foreign correspondent. I was on a beach at Porto in Portugal in April of 1976, on holiday from Lisbon, where I was covering the aftermath of the Portuguese Revolution, when the local postmistress shouted down the cliff that I had a letter to collect. It was from the paper's deputy editor, Luis Heron. I have some good news for you, he wrote. Paul Martin has requested to be moved from the Middle East. His wife has had more than enough, and I don't blame her. I am offering him the number 2 job in Paris, Richard Wig, Lisbon, and to you I offer the Middle East. Let me know if you want it. It would be a splendid opportunity for you, with good stories, lots of travel, and sunshine. In Hitchcock's thriller, Haverstock's editor calls him to his office before sending him to the European War and asks him, how would you like to cover the biggest story in the world today? Heron's letter was less dramatic, but it meant the same thing. I was 29 when I was being offered the Middle East. I wondered how King Faisal felt when he was offered Iraq, or how his brother Abdullah reacted to Winston Churchill's offer of Transjordan. Luis Heron was in the Churchillian mode himself, a stubborn, eloquent, and an enjoyer of fine wives, as well as himself a former Middle East correspondent. If the stories were good in journalistic terms, however, they would also prove to be horrific, the travel dizzying, the sunshine as cruel as a sword, and we journalists did not have the protection or the claims to perfection of kings. But now I could be one of the little army of historians who are writing history from beside the cannon's mouth. How innocent, how naive I was. Yet innocence, if we can keep it, protects a journalist's integrity. You have to fight to believe in it. Unlike my father, I went to war as a witness rather than a combatant, and ever more infuriated bystanders to be true. But at least I was not one of the impassioned, angry, sometimes demented men who made war. I worshipped the older reporters who had covered the Second World War and its aftermath, Howard K. Smith, who fled Nazi Germany on the last train from Berlin before Hitler declared war on the United States in 1941. James Cameron, whose iconic 1946 report from the Bikini Atom test was perhaps the most literary and philosophical article ever published in a newspaper. Being a Middle East correspondent is a slightly obscene profession to follow in such circumstances. If the soldiers I watched decided to leave the battlefield, they would, many of them, be shot for desertion, at least court-martialed. The civilians among whom I was to live and work were forced to stay on under bombardments, their families decimated by shell fire and air raids. As citizens of pariah countries, there should be no visas for them. But if I wanted to quit, if I grew sick of the horrors I saw, I could pack my bags and fly home business class, a glass of champagne in my hand, always supposing, unlike too many of my colleagues, that I hadn't been killed. Which is why I cringe each time someone wants to psychobabble about the trauma of covering wars, the need to obtain counseling for us well-paid scribes that we may be able to come to terms with what we have seen. No counseling for the poor and huddled masses that were left to Iraq's gas, Iran's rockets, the cruelty of Serbia's militias, the brutal Israeli invasions of Lebanon in 1982, the computerized deaths suffered by Iraqis during America's 2003 invasion of their country. I don't like the definition war correspondent. It is history, not journalism, that has condemned the Middle East to war. I think war correspondent smells a bit, reeks of false romanticism. It has too much of the whiff of Victorian reporters who would view battles from hilltops in the company of ladies immune to suffering, only occasionally glancing toward the distant pop-pop of cannon fire. Yet war is, paradoxically, a very powerful, unique experience for a journalist, an opportunity to indulge in the only vicarious excitement still free of charge. If you've seen the movies, why not experience the real thing? I fear that some of my colleagues have died this way, heading to war on the assumption that it's still Hollywood, that the heroes don't die, that you can't get killed like the others, that they'll all be Huntley Haverstocks with a scoop and the best girl. But you can get killed. In just 1 year in Bosnia, 30 of my colleagues died. There is a little psalm waiting for all innocent journalists. When I first set out to write this book, I intended it to be a reporter's chronicle of the Middle East over almost 3 decades. That is how I wrote my previous book, Pity the Nation, a first-person account of Lebanon's civil war and 2 Israeli invasions. But as I prowled through the shelves of papers in my library, more than 350,000 documents and notebooks and files, some written under fire in my own hand, some punched onto telegram paper by tired Arab telecommunications operators, many pounded out on the clacking telex machines we used before the internet was invented. I realized that this was going to be more than a chronology of eyewitness reports. My father, the old soldier of 1918, read my account of the Lebanon War, but would not live to see this book. Yet he would always look into the past to understand the present. If only the world had not gone to war in 1914. If only we had not been so selfish in concluding the peace. We victors promised independence to the Arabs and support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Promises are meant to be kept. And so those promises, the Jews naturally thought that their homeland would be in all of Palestine, were betrayed, and the millions of Arabs and Jews of the Middle East are now condemned to live with the results. In the Middle East, it is sometimes feels as if no event in history has a finite end, a crossing point, a moment when we can say stop, enough. This is where we will break free. I think I understand that time warp. My father was born in the century before last. I was born in the first half of the last century. Here I am, I tell myself, in 1980 watching the Soviet army invade Afghanistan, in 1982 cowering in the Iranian front line opposite Saddam's legions, in 2003 observing the first American soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division cross the Great Bridge over the Tigris River, and yet the Battle of the Somme opened just 30 years before I was born. Bill Fisk was in the trenches of France 3 years after the Armenian genocide, but only 28 years before my birth. I would be born within 6 years of the Battle of Britain, just over a year after Hitler's suicide. I saw the planes returning to Britain from Korea, and remember my mom telling me in 1956 that I was lucky, that had I been older, I would have been a British conscript invading Suez. If I feel this personally, it is because I have witnessed events that, over the years, can only be defined as an arrogance of power. The Iranians used to call the United States the center of world arrogance, and I would laugh at this, but I have begun to understand what it means. After the Allied victory of 1918, at the end of my father's war, the victors divided up the lands of their former enemies. In the space of just 17 months, they created the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the Middle East. And I have spent my entire career in Belfast and Sarajevo, in Beirut and Baghdad, watching the peoples within those borders burn. America invaded Iraq not for Saddam Hussein's mythical weapons of mass destruction, which had long ago been destroyed, but to change the map of the Middle East. Much of my father's generation had done more than 80 years earlier. Even as it took place, Bill Fisk's war was helping to produce the century's first genocide, that of 1.5 million Armenians, and laying the foundation for a second, that of the Jews of Europe. This book is also about torture and executions. Perhaps our work as journalists does open the door of the occasional cell. Perhaps we do sometimes save a soul from the hangman's noose. But over the years, there has been a steadily growing deluge of letters, both to myself and to the editor of The Independent, in which readers more thoughtful and more despairing than ever before plead to know how they can make their voices heard when democratic governments seem no longer inclined to represent those who elect them. How these readers ask, can they prevent a cruel world from poisoning the lives of their children? How can I help them? A British woman living in Germany wrote to me after The Independent published a long article of mine about the raped Muslim woman of Gako in Bosnia, women who had received no international medical aid, no psychological help, no kindness, 2 years after their violation. I suppose in the end we journalists try, or should try, to be the first impartial witnesses to history. If we have any reason for our existence, the least must be our ability to report history as it happens, so that no one can say we didn't know, no one told us. Amira Haas, the brilliant Israeli journalist on Haaretz newspaper, whose reports on the occupied Palestinian territories have outshone anything written by non-Israeli reporters, discussed this with me more than 2 years ago. I was insisting that we had a vocation to write the first pages of history, but she interrupted me. "No, Robert, you're wrong," she said. "Our job is to monitor the centers of power." And I think in the end that is the best definition of journalism I have heard, to challenge authority, all authority, especially so when governments and politicians take us to war, when they have decided that they will kill and others will die. But can we perform that task? This book will not provide an answer. My life as a journalist has been a great adventure. It still is. Yet looking through these pages after months of writing, I find they are filled with accounts of pain and injustice and horror, the sins of fathers visited upon their children. They are also about genocide. I used to argue, hopelessly I'm sure, that every reporter should carry a history book in his back pocket. In 1992, I was in Sarajevo, and once, as Serb shells swift over my head, I stood upon the very paving stone upon which Gavrilo Princip stood as he fired the fatal shot that sent my father to the trenches of the First World War. And of course the shots were still being fired in Sarajevo in 1992. It was as if history was a gigantic echo chamber. That was the year in which my father died. This is therefore the story of his generation, and of mine. In Beirut, June 2005.